Good evening. I'm David Nicholas. Next on CMU Public Television, our first extended conversation with the newly elected representative for Michigan's 98th State House District. I'm joined by Gary Glenn next here on Capitol Report.
Welcome to Capitol Report, a weekly discussion with your elected officials on the issues and concerns that affect you.
Term limits opened up the State House District in and around Midland in 2014. Gary Glenn won that August primary and then the general election in November. Congratulations, Representative Glenn, and thank you for joining us.
Dave, thanks for this opportunity. Look forward to it.
We are sitting down on a Friday morning for this news this week that the legislature is sending a bill to Governor Rick Snyder that would divert surplus monies in the school aid fund to offset the deficit in the current fiscal year budget. That deficit at around $500 million, money from the surplus at about $250 million. Noting that the surplus is just that and it was not included in any K-12 funding proposal, do you support the solution to deal with our current shortfall?
Yeah, I voted in favor of that. I think it passed on a largely party line vote. I think the real critical question from this point forward is to make sure that the Michigan the Michigan Economic Development Corporation's tax credit program is monitored in such a way that we anticipate in advance, that we know in advance that we're going to have these credits come due to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Supposedly, state government, or at least the legislative and executive branch, supposedly weren't aware of that until the end of December. Under questioning the other day on the Tax Policy Committee on which I sit, I was asking the Department of Treasury, did they in fact not know that these hundreds of millions of dollars in tax credits were coming down the pike? And they admitted that they had known as early as October. I said, did you really not know, or did we have a cool hand loop moment and we just had a failure to communicate? And we were able to determine that they did know about 3 months earlier. So this is something that the legislature should have been able to act on quicker, but didn't because the Department of Treasury didn't tell us there was going to be this shortfall. So we've got to monitor that program in the future to make sure we don't have to come back in the middle of a budget year. In this case, it didn't take a dime away from any public school in the state of Michigan. It was a surplus in the state school aid fund from the money that is appropriated. And then when you have attendance day, you determine how many children are actually in the classroom. So it was a surplus, no harm done this time, but we've got to better prepare for monitoring these tax credits as they come due in the future.
And we've been hearing about this amount of money, and you say it runs into the hundreds of millions that can be claimed. A couple of thoughts. Do we know the total figure now? And is there any limitation on the time? And by that I mean, is there another round, another batch of money that would somewhere down the road come, or are we dealing with this in the right here, and it's just a matter of time before businesses would claim those credits?
It is just a matter of time, and the program extends until 2032. And the estimated value of the still outstanding tax credits is now $9 billion. So this is something we have to pay serious attention to. Apparently, from what I've learned from the tax policy hearing where I led some of the questioning, is that the State Department of Treasury does know about these things a lot earlier than we've been led to believe, because Ford, Chrysler, GM, General Motors, Dow Chemical turn in these tax credits. First, let's acknowledge the fact that the tax credits have been earned is a good sign for Michigan's economy, because it is only extended for the creation of new jobs or the retention of existing jobs. So this is an indication that our economy is recovering. These large major corporations and major employers employing tens of thousands of people are creating and retaining jobs. That's a good thing. And we just have to have more transparency from the Department of Treasury, because these tax credits are submitted by the corporations, and then it takes about a 2-year auditing process by the Department of Treasury, which means that they know 2 years in advance, at least have some rough idea of when they're going to finish their process and when this would impact our budget. So we just simply have to demand from the executive branch of our state government that the Department of Treasury let the legislature know for its appropriating purposes a lot sooner than they did in this particular case.
So as we were looking ahead to the plannings for these budgets, you say it might have been as early as 2 years ago that we would have known, so that even the amount of money that was being put into rainy day funds, the amount of surplus that was being built up in the school aid fund might have been set aside.
That's correct.
Creating maybe a little bit less of a firestorm than we saw this week. Then.
That's right. The challenge from this point forward is not to get blindsided again. And I think we're going to be very aggressive. I certainly was on the Tax Policy Committee last week in grilling the Department of Treasury as to what did they know and when did they know it and why didn't they tell us. So that's something we're going to keep a sharp eye on from this point forward.
What about the concept of the credits themselves? Because when a lot of these deals were negotiated, it was during an extraordinarily bad economy, and acknowledged in the latter years of the Engler administration and through the years of the Granholm administration, deals were being made, I guess, for lack of a better way to phrase it, to hopefully keep companies here and not have companies leaving. Are we economically, budgetarily in a better situation where some of these deals we would hope wouldn't have to be made? And you pointed to the fact that it's a good sign the way they were structured, that they're being cashed in now is a better sign for the economy. But given the fact that they were negotiated during such poor times, where are we at moving forward to see where we might find ourselves in arrangements like this down the road?
These tax credits started under the Engler administration for the creation of new jobs. And then when we got into the recession that occurred during the Granholm administration, they were starting to be offered for the retention of jobs that already existed. No more tax credits are being offered. The program was cut off for the retention of jobs 3 or 4 years ago, but we still have contractual obligations, Dave. These were contracts that were signed with private employers in the state of Michigan who agreed to either create a certain number of new jobs or to be sure to retain new jobs so that GM, for example, didn't move to Texas or Louisiana. But it's a contractual obligation. You cannot pass legislation after the fact constitutionally under federal constitutional precedent. You can't pass legislation after the fact that negates a negotiated contract. So these contracts run as far out as 2032. What we have to do, because we cannot abrogate those contracts, is we have to know in advance what the timing is so that we can schedule the appropriate budgeting of state funds to make sure that we meet all the needs of state government with these tax credits as part of the mix.
How much should we have? Is there a right amount, feeling in Lansing, or maybe your own personal view on this, as how much should be in so-called rainy day funds, either general fund or school aid fund? We were able to go there to take care of this, but is there an amount that gives a feeling of security, we're okay? You know, to avert such crisis, is there an amount that Lansing has as a goal to keep in those funds, to keep on hand?
I have not heard that discussed, but as I'm looking at the state budget of over $50 billion, you know, 5% would be somewhere in the area of $2 billion. I know the Snyder administration has been forward-thinking in terms of paying down the unfunded liabilities of the pension systems, not only for the state employees that were incurred in the past. Of course, there aren't any more pensions in a lot of areas of state government. The legislature, for example, no longer gets pensions. A lot of it has been changed to a 401k defined contribution instead of a defined benefit program. But we still have a lot of unfunded liability that the governor has, with good foresight, I think, started to pay down. So whether it's $500 million, $1 billion, $2 billion, if we can meet the needs of state government and put some away in a rainy day fund, great. I don't have a specific figure that gives me one degree of comfort more than the other. What will give me greater comfort if the Department of Treasury will tell us in advance, maybe as far as 2 years in advance, when one of these tax credits is turned in, they should advise the legislature at that point so that we could budget out as far, anticipate as far as 2 years in advance of exactly what the schedule is going to be. That's the challenge on this problem, not the fact that our economy is recovering and people are actually creating or retaining the jobs they contractually agreed to do so. The fact that they are meeting those contracts from an economic standpoint is a good thing. And the tax credits may be collected 2 years down the line after they're turned in, but Michigan's economy is benefiting today from those new jobs, from people who are staying in retained jobs who are actually getting pay raises and are paying taxes on that income. So we're reaping the benefit of those new jobs or retained jobs now, even though the tax credits may not be turned in 2 or 3 years from now.
We are bound, as we're noting here, by the Constitution to have a balanced budget each year, but there is debt on the books, that of which we're talking about, and then also bonded monies that were tied to past road repair cycles in the state. House Speaker Cotter gave an explanation of this a few weeks back, and in talking about the May 5th ballot proposal of a funding formula that will take some of the money anticipated going towards paying down past bonded debt tied to the roads, and then over time shifting that more into full road repairs. Do you support that formula specifically and the road measure in general in terms of taking care, again, of some of those other past obligations?
Well, first of all, since you mentioned him, I want to acknowledge I'm on the campus of Central Michigan University, the alma mater of the Speaker of the House, Kevin Cotter. Kevin's my seatmate in that I represent part of Midland County, and he has not only Isabella County, but also part of Midland County. And I just want to say how pleased I am with Kevin Cotter's speakership after about 7 weeks. Just the demeanor and the image and the openness in our caucus under Kevin's leadership is refreshing and encouraging. Somebody asked him the other day from the media if the caucus had an official position on the May ballot measure, and his response was, no, that's up to each individual member. The only thing that we ask is that when you discuss it, you do so respectfully. So with utmost respect for the Speaker of the House, who I was proud to vote for to make our next Speaker of the House, and acknowledging the great job I think he has done since, I am aware that in his position of leadership, he feels obligated or may in fact sincerely believe that the May 5th ballot measure is the right way forward. I do not support the May 5th ballot measure. I believe that we can provide funding for road repair without raising taxes. The May 5th ballot measure takes 40% of the $1.9 billion a year in new tax revenue it raises and spends it on things other than roads. So it was a political concoction. It has school funding, it has mass transit funding, it has local government revenue sharing, it has an earned income tax credit being put back into place. All of these different sweeteners, so to speak, in hopes of cobbling together a coalition that would pass this on the ballot. The polling seems to indicate that it's not going to pass. Typically, for a ballot measure, the rule is you have to start out with about 60% in support to have a chance of passing on Election Day. And I haven't seen a poll yet. I think maybe one that had it as high as 52%. Some of the others are showing it in the 30s or 40%. So the prospects for its passage don't look good. The question is, what's Plan B? I'm working on Plan B and C, and I know the state senator's working on D, E, and F. So there are other proposals being put forward. Two of the ones that I'm seriously considering are simply to reintroduce two plans that were passed by the House under Republican control in the last legislative session. One would have allocated an additional $500 million to new road construction. The other would have allocated $1.2 billion to new road construction, and in both cases without raising taxes. I found in going door to door throughout Midland and Bay counties in 2014 that there was a disconnect among voters who just couldn't compute that we pay among the highest gas taxes in the country, and yet we have some of the worst roads in the country. That just did not compute, and the reason it didn't is because so much of the money that is collected from taxes on gas does not go to roads. And that's a similar complaint that I have and critique I have for the May 5th ballot measure. $1.9 billion a year in additional tax increases, and 40% of it is not going to roads. So it's not a question of going exclusively to repair and rebuild roads that are necessary not only for public safety, but also to attract new business and industry. I mean, having a solid infrastructure is a key factor in being able to attract new business and industry to Michigan and put people back to work or keep them at work.
Is there a plan or a portion of those plans? Again, you mentioned the ones that passed the House didn't pass the Senate, and vice versa, a Senate plan that did not clear the House in the last term prior to your election. The concerns were being raised at that point that and everyone is going to suddenly, in looking at the way things break down, voice his or her concern. And one of those came from the fact that if we shifted the gas taxes exclusively to funding the roads, so that that money would be going there, that we were going to create a budget hole in several different places, including the school aid fund. So part of what has been reported by the supporters of the ballot proposal is that now we do take care of both. So in anything that's being considered, either reintroducing or reworking of those past measures, do we address all of those other things that the past formula was paying for?
Well, the original proposal that was passed by the State House of Representatives last year that added about $500 million for new road construction had no effect on other areas of the budget. It did not take anything away from the school aid fund, for example, now or in the future. The second proposal that was passed that would have generated $1.2 billion a year for new road construction would have, over the course of time in the future, redirected money toward what we claim is one of our highest priorities, and that is fixing our roads and bridges. And other areas of the budget would have been affected. But I asked this question the other day, and I thought I knew what the answer was, but it was confirmed. We were talking about Washington, D.C. type math, Dave. We're not talking about cuts. We're talking about reductions in increases. So the Washington, D.C. math says, you know, that if I got $10 billion last year and I asked for $15 billion this year and you only give me $14 billion, then that's a $1 billion cut. That's Washington, D.C. math. The reality is you just got a $4 billion increase. So the effect it would have had over time on other areas of the budget, the second proposal that passed the House last year, was not in actual cuts, but perhaps in reduced increases, which still leave you net ahead. So we're looking at those two proposals. They passed the House, did not pass the Senate under former Senate Majority Leader Randy Richardville, but there are those of us who expect that Senator Arlen Meekhoff, who is the new Senate Majority Leader, would be more receptive to a plan that helps us fix our roads and bridges without raising taxes. I wrote, as a candidate for this position, I signed a written pledge that I would not support raising taxes on the people of the state of Michigan. I intend to keep that promise that I made, and I believe that the math proves that it is possible to improve our roads, repair roads, reconstruct roads where needed, put up new roads where needed, without raising taxes on the people of Michigan, especially when there's so many other areas of the budget. Let me give you just one more example. There's a study by Anderson Economics out of Lansing that says that the people of Michigan spend an additional $223 million a year on new public school construction because of the inflated wage requirements of the prevailing wage law, which says, for example, if you want to build a new elementary school in Midland County or Isabella County, you can't put it out to bid and get union and non-union contractors to offer bids and get the best wage rates you could find for Isabella or Midland counties. Instead, you're required by state law to pay union scale wages and benefits that are set in more metropolitan areas like Flint or Detroit. And the estimate is that adds $223 million a year to new school construction costs. The estimate also says that over the last decade, if the prevailing wage law had not been in effect for public education, we could have built an additional 300 elementary schools throughout Michigan for the same amount of money that it cost us to pay the inflated wage requirements of the prevailing wage law. So that's why when Speaker of the House Cotter announced our 78 very clearly lined out objectives for the next 2 years. The first one we've talked about, the first priority of both the state Senate and the state Republican caucus in the House is to repeal prevailing wage, let union as well as non-union contractors bid on those public works projects. It's a total savings of $400 million, according to one estimate, when you take into account road construction as well as public school construction. But that's just one glaring example where we are engaging in redistribution of wealth, taking from the people of Michigan, benefiting a very small segment of our society to the detriment of what's good for the people of Michigan, our school children overall. I think we ought to save $223 million a year in public school construction costs, and instead of spending that $223 million on the labor required to put the bricks and mortar up for the new classroom, we ought to be spending that money on the children in the classroom. So that's just one example of where we could change state policy and save hundreds of millions of dollars a year, which could be diverted to more important things like the kids in the classroom or to fixing our roads and bridges.
Prevailing wage, right to work, both issues that in this state with the history that it has with organized labor have become very contentious. We learned this week too of Wisconsin's move, and with a nod to the Michigan legislature from the efforts of 2012, that Wisconsin could become the 25th following Michigan to become a right to work state. News also then that came this week as we were preparing to sit down with you about a potential to extend the right to work provisions to police and firefighters under the current framework that we have. Tell us more about that.
Well, Michigan is currently the only right-to-work state in America, and let's define that for people who may not know what we're talking about. A right-to-work law simply says that if you're in a unionized workplace, you are completely free to join, pay dues to, and support the union if you choose to do so. But what right to work added to the law was the civil rights protection, protecting employees against job discrimination or being fired or threatened or somehow punished if they choose, as a matter of individual freedom or rights of conscience, not to join or pay dues to a particular private organization. For me, it's a moral issue. I think it's immoral to force someone to give money to a private organization as a condition of being able to keep their jobs. And I think that ought to apply all the more so to those people who put their lives on the line for us in public safety jobs like firefighters, police officers, and state troopers. So there really are two principles in this legislation that I'm going to introduce. One is to say we're already a right-to-work state. We already protect all other private sector and other government sector employees' freedom to choose and rights of conscience in the workplace. Join the union, don't join the union, financially support them or don't. Either way, you're protected from job discrimination and penalty. So there's that principle. The second principle is we already protect that freedom and right of conscience for other employees. Why were firefighters, police officers, and state troopers exempted from that same civil rights protection? And
that is the question. You were not, as we've noted in the legislature at the time, but what have you come to understand as to why, as it was structured, votes passing at the excuse me, the end of 2012, then why was that exemption in there at the time?
As I said, Michigan's the only right-to-work state in America whose right-to-work law does not apply to public safety personnel. I can't speak for the governor, what his thinking was. I gather, and I was fairly involved in the process when it was happening, didn't agree with it when it was happening, because I believe that the freedom of choice should apply to all employees. Best I can gather, it was a strictly political consideration. They were trying to calculate which unions were more likely to support Republicans and which Democrats. That doesn't matter to me. As a matter of principle, I think that our right-to-work law and its protections for people's freedom to choose ought to apply to all employees in the state. And I have a second bill that's kind of a corollary that resolves one of the major objections you hear from union officials about right-to-work legislation. They will say that right-to-work requires them to continue to represent non-members who are now free to choose not to pay dues, but they nonetheless have to represent them in contractual negotiations and grievance processing. The second bill that I've introduced would say that government employee unions, which are the only ones the legislature has authority over, all private sector unions are under Congress, federal law, but that for government sector unions in Michigan from this point forward, they would represent, they would have no requirement, they would have no authority to represent anybody other than employees who voluntarily join and pay dues. So if an employee wants to be a member of the union and be covered by the union contract, they'd be free to choose that. If they choose not to join or pay dues to a union, they would negotiate for themselves. The union would no longer have any legal requirement or authority to represent people who are not dues-paying members. There's a story in MLive today in which a board member of the Professional Organization of Police Officers for the state of Michigan said that he was opposed to right-to-work being extended. That's not a surprise. But he said he saw no problem, in fact, thought it was a positive, didn't think there would be any objection from organized labor to the second bill, which says that unions will represent only those employees who want their representation, who have chosen to join and pay dues. So I'm optimistic about that second bill, but both of them are motivated by just a simple matter of principle. Each employee in our state, I believe, should be free to choose whether or not to join or pay dues to a union.
Many things that we had hoped to get to, and we're probably going to have to look at another chance to sit down and talk with you about those. But I guess I would sum up now in our last minute by at least dealing with those that you've talked about. What are the prospect? Well, not the prospects for those bills, but the timeline. They have been introduced, or where are we at in terms of the process for right to work, and where do you see those and moving along in the timeline?
I'm still in the process of gathering co-sponsors, and I had a sense of timing regarding, you mentioned earlier, Wisconsin becoming America's 25th right to work state, and I think we're hitting a tipping point. The states of Kentucky and West Virginia, New Mexico are also considering right to work legislation. So I think this is a principle that is getting traction and taking root across America. And so my thinking was, now is as good a time as any to introduce this legislation as a matter of principle to extend our state right to work law to all employees, and not to leave some employees off in a carve-out situation where they don't have the same civil rights protection against job discrimination on the basis of union affiliation. So I'll introduce them probably next week. The national focus is going to be on Wisconsin passing a right to work law for private sector employees. So that'll be a good time, I think, to at least introduce the legislation, to draw public attention to it. And then we've got another 22 months in the legislative process during this session. Sometimes those bills move quickly, and sometimes they move slowly, and sometimes they don't move at all. But you never know until you try. So that's my motivation. Is I think all employees in the state deserve the same protections as our right to work law currently applies to all teachers, to state and local government employees, to private sector employees. I think they ought to apply to our firefighters and police officers, particularly those people who are willing to put their lives on the line for us every day.
Well, in regards to House Joint Resolution G and issues for the Veterans Affairs and also for Commerce and Trade and much more, hopefully we'll have a chance then to invite you back to discuss some things further. If you're open to that, we'd like to have you back in the program.
Dave, I'd love to be back anytime you ask. So.
And thank you for the time today. We do appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your time and attention as well. We've been speaking with State Representative Gary Glenn, newly elected representative for Michigan's 98th House District. A reminder that as these programs come your way, within a few days, we also post them to our website, WCMU.org. Click on the button for TV, and then there is also a page for the locally produced programs. You'll find there a link to the Capitol Report page and the link to eventually this, and then the other past programs that we've already had, this season. For all of us here, our crew, and all that have put the program together, I'm David Nicholas. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk again.
You've been watching Capitol Report. Join us again as your elected officials speak to your concerns on current issues.